Starting once again. Wow, this just will not leave the news. Let's talk one more time about Stormy Daniels and the alleged affair she had with the President of the United States. As we've mentioned now several times, she allegedly signed an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement where she cannot talk about whatever it is that happened. But yesterday, Stormy Daniels, what Stephanie Clifford is her real name, and her lawyer said they are happy to give the money back. They are saying to Donald Trump, you can have your $130,000 back if you want it. Why is she doing that?
Because he takes it back. Did.
Exactly. So one, if he takes the money back, that is proof that there is an agreement in the first place, and you'd have to ask the question as to why that would ever happen. But also, if he takes the money back, the agreement is void, and now she can say and talk and do whatever she wants. And she could, in a way, make more money this way. How could she make more money by giving away $130,000? Exactly. This is called a book deal, ladies and gentlemen, because someone out there would be happy to publish the tell-all book of whatever Stormy Daniels has to say about her time with Donald Trump. Now, included in this was this idea here. Once the money goes back, Ms. Clifford, she's Stormy Daniels, will be allowed to speak openly and freely about the relationship, blah, blah, blah. But the important part here is part B, which is this right here. She would also be able to publish any text messages, photos, or videos relating to the president. What does that mean, ladies and gentlemen? Does that mean that she has incriminating pictures of the president in their time together? We'll see where this goes. Certainly the story just keeps on, it has legs, it keeps on moving. We'll see what happens. That's enough of that for now. Let's move on. Second story is about a British spy. This agent here named Sergei Skripal. Sure. Who yesterday was collapsed in his home in Britain. He is a British agent, but he's what's called a double agent. That means that he actually pretended to work for Russia, you could probably tell by his name, but was actually sending secrets, Russian secrets, to Great Britain. And yesterday when he collapsed and was taken to the hospital, it turns out he had been poisoned. And not only had he been poisoned, but the poison was made in only one place in all of the world. Can you imagine where it came from? Russia. Russia's a pretty good guess, actually. Vladimir Putin strikes again. This is not the first time Russia has poisoned or assassinated people who have spied against them before. But you have to understand that this guy right here, Sergei S., he is a British citizen who was living in Britain at the time. That is a direct attack on a British citizen on British soil. Great Britain is not happy about this and went ahead immediately to blame Russia and said that they have to answer up for their crimes in the next 24 hours. Not only that, but our Secretary of State, this man right here, Rex Tillerson, he corroborated and said, yes, Russia is clearly to blame here. They should pay a price for this. And what happened next?
Donald Trump fired him.
Donald Trump fired the Secretary of State yesterday. This is huge, ladies and gentlemen. This is one of the most powerful positions in the government. And the White House is saying, well, we're not totally sure it's Russia after all, which is a pretty unusual stance to take. So the firing of a Secretary of State is extremely unusual. This is the shortest anyone has ever served as Secretary of State, at least in the last century. And what's more unusual about it is the way that he was fired. Donald Trump sent this tweet yesterday, in which he talked about who the new Secretary of State would be, this man named Mike Pompeo. But he also mentioned how, well, the new director of the CIA will be Gina Haspel. She'll be the first female director of the CIA in American history, which is cool. And he also says, thank you to Rex Tillerson for your service. But here's the thing. Allegedly, this is how Rex Tillerson found out he was fired. He read it on the internet. No one told him. Donald Trump never came and personally said, you're resigning, you're done with your job. Someone said, hey, you should probably check Donald Trump's Twitter feed. And when he looked on it, that's when he realized he wasn't Secretary of State anymore. This is pretty unusual, and not typically the way this is done. Remember that Secretary of the State is part of the line of succession to become president. If the vice president dies, who becomes president?
Secretary.
Not quite. Who's third in line?
The thing, is it the Senate pro tem?
Not quite yet. Speaker of the House, very good. And then it's Senate President, pro tempore, and then a Secretary of State. It's not far down the list, so this is a huge deal. That this happened, and it looks like he might have been fired for talking about Russia specifically, which is a whole other can of worms, right? The thing is that Rex Tillerson and the president have had a bit of history before. He was hired by the president immediately when the president became president a year ago, and he served ever since. The thing is that Rex Tillerson got in hot water last year for something he called the president. What did he call the president last year? allegedly, he referred to the president as a moron. And when this happened, it caused a big press thing, and people were talking about this. Oh my gosh, it's just hearsay, it didn't really happen. So Rex Tillerson held a press conference in which he said, I believe in the president is correct, I'm happy to stand by him. But Tillerson never actually denied the claim. He never said, no, I didn't call the president a moron. And that is a pretty big deal when you are the guy who reports directly to the President of the United States. Now, Donald Trump said the whole story had been completely made up, and then challenged the news agencies that broke the story. And when he did this, the reporter who actually reported on the story had a clarification to make. As it turns out that he had not called the president a moron, he used a slightly different term instead, which I had to black out for you. And if this is true, and remember Tillerson never denied this, then I don't know, maybe this is still part of why this all happened. Now, when Donald Trump saw this part of the story, what happened next was absolutely fascinating, because Donald Trump at that point challenged Rex Tillerson to an IQ test, ladies and gentlemen. That's what happened next. He said we should both have an IQ test right now. I'll prove that I'm smarter than Rex Tillerson. The IQ test never happened. But it was just kind of this fascinating moment in history. Is this still part of, is this kind of the revenge for his name calling back 4 months ago? I don't know. But a fascinating story nonetheless, okay? All right, my last story for you today is about Chicago, actually. And one of the most famous Chicago radio stations was closed down this week. The Loop 97.9 for 40 years was a classic rock station in Chicago. I grew up on this station. This is what I listened to. And they played all kinds of stuff. They played mostly rock from the 70s, the 60s and 70s and 80s. And this is part of my childhood. I was sad to hear that they finally, radio's kind of dying off in general because of satellite radio and XM and all of that other stuff. But what made 97.9 the most famous, kind of the most famous moment in history, is this thing called Disco Demolition Night. Now, if you've not heard of this before, it is one of the most famous moments in all of sports history. And it's all started by this radio DJ named Steve Dahl, who, as you can tell, was not a huge fan of disco. Disco music in the 1970s was a huge thing. You know, it came out of nowhere, and for 4 years it was like the most popular music in America. But it's not for everybody. And a lot of people who liked classic rock kind of pushed back against it, especially the radio station 97.9. Now, our story will take us to the White Sox, because the White Sox in Comiskey Field back in 1979 did promotions, like all ballparks do. Like, come in, get 2 hot dogs for the price of 1, or get a free souvenir T-shirt or whatever else. But they came up with this new promotion, which is called Disco Demolition Night. It was for people that hated disco music. The idea is that if you showed up on that day, it was a doubleheader day, they were playing against the Tigers, 2 baseball games in 1, and if you brought a disco record, this big vinyl record, you would get a discounted ticket. Your ticket would cost $1. $1 is all you would pay to get into a White Sox game. An incredible deal, right? And it turns out they weren't sure if this would really work or not, because the goal was, if enough people showed up, they would take these records, they would pile them onto the center of the field, and they would blow them up with dynamite. How could this possibly go wrong, you ask? Well, it turns out it did. So the first thing is, they weren't sure if people would show up at all. Like, you don't want to blow up 5 records in the middle of the field. It's going to look stupid. They didn't have to worry about that. It was the highest attendance record for Comiskey Park in the White Sox in history. 70,000 people showed up. They were climbing over the walls to get in, all of them with their 1 plastic record. And the disco hate was huge that night. Now, there are a number of problems with this plan. And the first problem is that the record itself. You know what records look like, the old vinyl records? They look exactly like Frisbees, and they kind of work the same way. So immediately in game 1, there were problems because people were just chucking records across the stadium, trying to hit players. It was a disaster from the first moment. But in between games, after game 1 finished, the disc jockey, Steve Dahl, dressed in full military uniform, drove out in an army jeep to the center of the field to blow off all of these records. They had them all in this giant dumpster right there. The problem was that they used too much dynamite. And in fact, they blew a giant crater into the middle of Comiskey Park. Which, remember, they still had a whole other game of baseball to play. So that's problem 2, right? We've got flying Frisbee records. We've got a giant hole in the middle of the field that they can't repair. And then afterwards, you've probably been to a game where you've seen someone run out on the field before. Like, it's always fun to see people like run and they get tackled by security. It's always this fun, entertaining moment. The problem was In this moment, it wasn't one person who ran onto the field. It was a lot of people who ran onto the field. It was everyone who ran onto the field. And the police were totally overwhelmed. There's no way to stop all these people. No way to get them off the field. They had the announcers, Harry Carey was on the mic and saying, please, can we get back? Can we play some baseball? People were not leaving. There were parties, there were conga lines. People had set up parties. They were drinking beer in the middle of the field. They were pouring beer into puddles on the field. Remember, there's another game of baseball still to go, and they couldn't get anyone off the field. At one point, the field was on fire. There were actual fires in the middle of the field as this was going on, and the police finally had to be called in en masse to basically remove the crowd from the field. By the time they did, with fire still on the field, giant beer puddles, craters in the middle of it, they could not play another game. The White Sox had to forfeit the second game of the series, and it is known forever as like the worst promotion in the history of baseball. So an incredible moment, Disco Demolition Night. But anyway, to wrap the story up, the Loop closed down just 2 days ago at midnight. And at midnight, a new station would take over. In this case, it was a Christian rock radio station that was taking over for classic. Well, classic rock tends to be very anti-establishment, and so they had a chance right before midnight to play their final songs, which they did. 3 last songs before 97.9 The Loop signed off forever, and the songs they played were Shout at the Devil, followed by The Number of the Beast, followed by Highway to Hell. So, goodbye 97.9, you will be missed. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's take our